Hello, Rustaceans, and welcome to another episode of This Week in Rust here on the Rustacean Station. As always, I'm Nell Shamrell-Harrington, lead editor of This Week in Rust, and also a senior staff research engineer on the Rust team at Mozilla. This episode covers issue number 351 of This Week in Rust, published on August 11th, 2020. After going through this week's news, we will continue our interview series with speakers of the upcoming RustConf. This week we will hear from Micah Tigley, Rebecca Turner, and Samuel Lim. Each speaker will introduce themselves and give you a brief preview of their talk at the end of this episode. First, the news. At the time of this recording, there were no official Rust-related announcements this week. In terms of tooling, both Rust Analyzer and IntelliJ Rust have released new versions. As a reminder, Rust Analyzer and IntelliJ Rust are Rust language plugins for integrated development environments, also known as IDEs. The difference is that IntelliJ Rust focuses on IntelliJ-based IDEs, while Rust Analyzer focuses on IDEs like VS Code and editors like Emacs and Vim. Both are extensively used by the Rust community. Check out the changelogs for all the latest updates. Next, several newsletters covering specialized areas of the Rust ecosystem were released this week as well. Check out This Month in Rust Game Dev and Rust and Blockchain for lots of great content on those topics. If you are interested in observations and thoughts on the Rust language from your fellow Rustaceans, make sure you look at the Observations and Thoughts section of this week's issue. This includes an interview with Rust core team member Steve Klabnik by Evron, an article on the Beyond the Loop blog on why learning Rust is great as a second language, and a Spanish language article on why the author likes Rust so much, and much more. Moving on to our largest section, the Learning section, now divided into its own subsections. We continue to see so much fantastic content on learning both the Rust language and the Rust ecosystem. If you are looking for advice on testing async Rust code, be sure to read 2 Easy Ways to Test Async Functions in Rust by Klaus Matzinger. In order to work with async functions in Rust, you need to use an async runtime like Tokyo. Rust built-in tests do not come with a runtime, at least not yet. If you are using a framework like Actix Web, the framework might include testing support via an additional attribute. For projects that do not use a web framework, you can use a testing runtime like Tokyo Test. Tokyo Test includes a function to reverse what async functions do and block the execution until the async function has returned. This allows you to verify that these functions do what you expect them to do. See the full article for several examples. Along with testing, this week's newsletter also features an article on refactoring Rust code by Philip Daniels. Daniel's article, Cloning Yourself, a Refactoring for Thread Spawning Rust Types, will take you through refactoring a piece of code that starts with, among other things, an arc within an arc, and ends in a much more readable and maintainable place. If you are intrigued by how Rust manages memory, you will like Ivan Vesilov's new blog entry titled Allocation API, Allocators, and Virtual Memory. This article explores allocators in general and their Rust API in particular. Give it a read for an in-depth intro to memory allocations and how Rust uses them. This week's issue also features a Portuguese article on learning Rust by Rodolfo Gigi. Luca Palmieri has published Chapter 3 of the Zero to Production series. This series is focused on API development in Rust. This new chapter covers bootstrapping a Rust web API from scratch. It includes information on choosing a web framework, creating a basic health check endpoint, and writing an integration test. I have enjoyed watching this series progress and am looking forward to future entries. One area of content I have seen explode this year is Rust-related videos and live streams. The Crust of Rust series by John Jainset is particularly fantastic. In the latest entry, in John's own words, we cover multi-produce/single consumer MPSC channels by re-implementing some of the standard sync MPSC types from the standard library. As part of that, we cover what channels are used for, how they work at a high level, different common channel variants, and common channel implementations. In the process, we go over some common Rust concurrency primitives like mutex and convar. If you are interested in embedded Rust, check out a recording of a live stream by James Munns, Steve Klabnik, and Michael Gattosi as they mob program together in Rust. In the process, they use a new project from Ferris Systems called Knurling. That's KNURLING-RS. Moving on to call for participation, several Rust open source projects are looking for contributors. These include Cargo, Rust Dependency Manager, .env linter, which, as the name suggests, lints .m files, Ruma, a set of Rust library crates for working with the Matrix Online Communication Protocol, TensorBase, a modern engineering effort for building a high-performance and cost-effective big data warehouse, and Libra SOC, a project that, in its own words, allows you to take complex algorithms usually intended for power-hungry servers with big fat GPUs and run them on tiny devices like smartwatches, cell phones, and pocket drones without changing your code at all. Moving on to RFCs, it's a somewhat quiet week with no RFCs approved and none in final comment period. However, 3 new RFCs were proposed this week. The first is a proposal for POSIX error numbers in standard OS Unix. This RFC proposes adding a standard OS Unix error number struct for storing and comparing POSIX error numbers. Next, the proposal titled Standardized Methods for Leaking Containers, which describes a standard set of methods for converting container types like box, arc, vec, and string to and from raw pointers. Finally, the last RFC introduces the self macro meta variable as a companion to the crate macro meta variable. The self macro meta variable would allow macros hygienic access to items. For full details on all of these RFCs, along with the current discussion, make sure to view them on GitHub. As for Rust jobs, Equilibrium, Deriva DEX, and Casper Labs are all looking for Rust engineers. See the newsletter for the links to the job postings for all the information. Moving on to events, lots of meetups are happening around the world, including online ones in Saarbrücken, Germany, Dallas, Texas, San Diego, California, and Vancouver, British Columbia. There are also currently in-person meetups scheduled in Columbus, Ohio, Dallas, Texas, and Seoul, South Korea. Finally, make sure not to miss RustConf, taking place online on August 20th. And that's a great transition into our interviews with the RustConf speakers. This week we hear from Micah Tigley, Rebecca Turner, and Samuel Lim. Let's start with Micah Tigley. Could you introduce yourself for our listeners?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Mika, and I'm a software engineer working on Firefox at Mozilla. In particular, I work on the Firefox developer tools team. And I started learning about Rust when I received a copy of the Rust programming language book. And while I was learning, I wanted to apply some of that knowledge on real Rust projects.
It makes sense. Often the best way to learn is by doing it, or some combination of looking at tutorials, looking at books, and then doing some sort of real life project.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, what's the topic of your talk?
So the topic of my talk is I'm going to be talking about beginning game development with Rust. So in this talk, I'm going to be going over how I started developing my first, and it's still in progress, game using the Amethyst game engine.
That sounds great. Can you tell us a little bit about the Amethyst game engine?
Yeah, so it's an open source Rust project that it provides a framework for developing video games using like the entity component system. So it's a really good modular open source project that I think is like really good for people who are trying to get into game development and Rust to like get started with. They have great documentation. They have a nice tutorial to help you build your own Pong game using the ECS component system.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
And what drew you to this topic?
So I've always been interested in game development, but I have always felt it was difficult to find a good place to start. So because there's just so many resources out there, and it's hard to pick something that works with your learning style and with your goals. So for myself, I wanted to work on something with strong documentation while also allowing me to develop using Rust. And I found that the Amethyst game engine project like provided me with these.
That sounds awesome. I know for so many Rust developers, both those who are learning Rust and even those who are very experienced with Rust, figuring out how to decide which library to use when there's multiple libraries available is a challenge. And it sounds like you've got a great perspective on that.
Thank you.
All right. And finally, what can our audience look forward to about your talk?
So I hope that this talk will help inspire other beginners to Rust or game development in general to try tackling projects they might otherwise not feel comfortable about doing due to their lack of knowledge or skill in an area that they're interested in. And I wanted to show that starting your own project is an iterative process and that it is okay to apply your knowledge in bite-sized pieces. So when I wanted to get into game development with Rust, like I definitely didn't start with Amethyst game engine project right away. I looked at other alternatives, and at least for me, I couldn't really get into, some of the knowledge that was required for me to really start making something. And so I felt that when I finally came across Amethyst, that gave me that, that foundation for me to actually start something.
Sounds great. Well, I am really looking forward to your talk, and I'm sure our listeners are looking forward to it too.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you again. Now let's hear from Rebecca Turner. Could you introduce yourself for our listeners?
Yeah, I'm Rebecca. I'm an undergraduate at Brandeis University. I really like static analysis, data structures, any code that like people don't see or touch usually. Yeah.
That sounds great. And what's the topic of your talk?
Rust for non-systems programmer. A lot of the documentation and discussion about Rust historically has been about Rust as a competitor to languages like C++, right? Other systems languages. And when you're comparing Rust to C++, you've got a lot of features that are really cool, right? You've got these really fantastic memory safety features. You've got these really cool concurrency tools and stuff like that, right? But for programmers who have been working with dynamic languages like, Ruby or Python or JavaScript or whatever, a lot of those features aren't very exciting, right? If you start talking to a Python programmer about memory safety, like that's not a compelling reason to switch because Python is already memory safe, right? Which I think is a little bit of a shame because Rust has a lot of cool features and tools that make programming like fun and enjoyable and safer in a lot of really significant ways. So I want to talk about, kind of the toolkit that Rust gives us and why I think it makes a good replacement for dynamic languages in a lot of circumstances.
Sounds great. And I think you may have already answered this a bit, but what drew you to this topic? Was it your experience as a non-systems programmer?
Yeah, pretty much. So I've written non-systems code in both systems and non-systems programming languages, but Rust was the new one for me. And particularly a few years ago, learning Rust was kind of frustrating because there's a lot of the Rust documentation and books or stuff are written at least sort of from the perspective or assuming that kind of like what, stuff like pointers and memory management are. And if that's not stuff you really deal with all the time, it can be a little bit confusing to deal with that stuff, right? And the story's definitely gotten better over the past few years, but I was always kind of struck by how the features that I found most important and enjoyable in Rust were not the ones that showed up like anywhere on the front page. So yeah, it's my experience like being kind of frustrated with this and wanting to show off these kind of less acknowledged parts.
Awesome. And what can our audience look forward to about your talk?
What can my audience look forward to about my talk? Learning a little bit of Rust, hopefully. Let me see. That's a tough question.
I know I came from the Ruby world before I came to the Rust world, and I can imagine that people who do come from those Ruby, Python, JavaScript worlds can look forward to getting a lot of information about Rust from that perspective from your talk.
I think people can look forward to getting kind of a different perspective on Rust, particularly if some of the articles about Rust and stuff have been a little bit too low level focused, right? So if you're someone who doesn't really care about performance that often, or rarely if ever needs to write asynchronous code, or doesn't really want to use or think about a language where stuff like memory errors are a thing, then I think the talk will be pretty cool, hopefully.
Well, I know I'm definitely looking forward to it, and I'm certain our listeners are too. We'll see you at RustConf.
Yeah, I'll see you then.
And finally, let's talk to Samuel Lim.
Sure. My name is Samuel Lim. My handle is Amadeusine if you ever look for my GitHub or anything, but there we go.
All right. Let's go into question number 1. Could you introduce yourself for our listeners?
Sure. So I am a researcher or software engineer or biologist, if you'd really like to put it that way. And I've been working with Rust for a good few years now, almost since a little bit after 1.0. And now I've been getting a little bit more engaged with the community, and I'm excited to see the results.
Awesome. And what's the topic of your talk for RustConf?
So I'll just go with the title of my talk, and that is Exploring Fast and Safe Rust for Biology. We're really trying to look at how the biological sciences and using tools built in Rust or things that are in the Rust ecosystem can really meld together.
And what drew you to this topic? Besides, obviously you work as a biologist and you work with Rust.
As a biologist, but also as a person that uses Rust in certain circumstances, I think that biology and Rust haven't had too much interaction over time. And really, I'd like to see how we can look at the melding of the two, and also how we can look at how it affects our prospects in the future in terms of software development, but also really in terms of biological analysis too. Even this year, we've been facing a lot of growth in terms of software tooling, especially with related to the COVID-19, SARS-2. And I think it's very pressing to know how we can each play a role in terms of building better software for biology or otherwise.
Sounds great. Well, what can our audience look forward to about your talk?
We'll be going over some foundations of biology, but we'll also be looking at a lot of areas of Rust and how it fits into a larger ecosystem of tools for biology, but also how you, maybe as a fresh Rustacean, can interact with this ecosystem and maybe even contribute to it.
Sounds great. Well, I am really looking forward to your talk, and I'm sure all of our audience is too.
Well, I'm excited as well, and I think it'll be good.
As a reminder, RustConf registration is still open, and I hope to see you all there. Make sure to listen next week for more interviews with the upcoming speakers. And that's all for this week's podcast. Make sure to check out the full issue of This Week in Rust for even more fantastic Rust content. This Week in Rust is edited by myself, Andre Bogus, and Colton Donnelly. This week's contributors included, using their GitHub usernames, Katsugulario, Vishal Sodani, Abe Buchheimer, Humble, Zethra, and Josh Triplett. As always, if you write a great article in Rust or happen to see one, please submit it to This Week in Rust by opening a pull request on our GitHub repo. Have a wonderful week, everyone, and please stay safe out there.